Hello class, I'm excited to share my research with the group again. This week I explored JSTOR in search of articles addressing the women's movement during the Cold War era and its association with the Communist Party of the United States. In this endeavor, I'm reminded of Liberty's biblical worldview principles that God has established order, intelligence, and truth in the universe and history, and that the Bible teaches all men to recognize their human limitations. In exploring academic research, I'll not only seek truth about my own subject, but I'll also critique the work of others, which I recognize is inherently imperfect, as is mine. So, I began my search very specific to see how inundated the literature was. I was pleasantly surprised to find only one journal result in the last 5 years containing both CPUSA and women's liberation. It's unfortunate for my background research, but promising for my potential contribution to the field. Broadening my search a bit, I was able to try several keywords like women's liberation and American communism, feminism and CPUSA, etc. Eventually, I identified 3 recent articles that will help to pave the way for my own efforts. The first recent article I'm highlighting was published in the Journal for the Study of Radicalism in 2014. Denise Lin is one of my favorite scholars, and she focuses primarily on primary sources in this article, painting a picture against a backdrop of 2 seminal pieces of work, Wiegand's Red Feminism and McDuffie's Sojourning for Freedom about Black communist activists. She composes a narrative of Claudia Jones's activism and the community with which she interfaces, and uses a framework set out by McDuffie known as triple exploitation or triple oppression. While history has been written about communist feminist activism, Lin offers an alternative explanation of the legacy that led to communist feminism in America, resting upon Black women's contributions. Similarly, Busch-Yankovsky revisits the history of radical feminism in this article, focusing on a few particular primary sources, but mainly applying a feminist theory framework to her revisionist take on feminism. Using feminist classics like Wiegand's Red Feminism, The Dialectic of Sex, and Sexual Politics, she hopes to lay the groundwork for future revisionist study of specific facets of the women's movement. Like Lin's narrative about Claudia Jones, Lisa Levinstein, in her 2014 article in the Journal of American History, centers her entire work on primary sources, including laws, speeches, letters, magazines, photos, newspapers, and pamphlets. She inserts her own empirical analysis throughout, which is also rooted in feminist theory. She examines the role, actions, and attitudes of displaced homemakers, centering on Trish Summers. These papers are mainly revisionist in nature, all 3 of them, and center on individuals who led other women in a movement. They are only tangentially related to the Communist Party, so it would appear that there is more work to do in academically connecting activist movements and organizations with American communism. In the next 2 articles that I'm going to talk about, which aren't exactly on the subject, we'll address kind of why that hasn't happened historically. Although we were tasked with identifying articles, I found this book chapter particularly interesting. In this 2017 book, U.S. Women's History, Castledine discusses the opening of Soviet records, which helps unravel some of America's Cold War activism. She discusses her personal use of the various records and correspondence, but bemoans the cleansing and redaction of such archives. Her main argument and her conclusion is that red baiting and the fear of it have altered the memorialization of history. That kind of redaction affirms the need for revisionist research to uncover the hidden parts of Cold War history and to remove the legacy of McCarthyism to get at the truth. Lastly, I identified another historiographical piece which presents an encyclopedic variety of primary and secondary sources on the trajectory of U.S. women's history. Fredrickson surveys American women's history, noting the different approaches and central publications. She also delves into new ways to approach it, like taking an international perspective, a comparative women's history, looking at U.S. women in a global context, and also looking at labor and women's organizations. She argues that these new trajectories have practical value in terms of both scholarship and activism, that they are inextricably linked to politics, and that it's time to leave behind American exceptionalism and place our women on the global stage.